This is the Lexicon podcast with Mike Hollows and JP Maxwell. Hi, Mike.
Hi, John. How you doing?
Very good, Tar, yeah. So this is kind of the podcast rebooted, reloaded, etc., etc.
2.0, as the kids say.
2.0, kind of with COVID, hopefully in the rear view. But it started sort of just before that era. We had the first version, the first iteration of it then, but I think we're looking at picking up some of the threads that we had before and developing them. We're in a kind of brave new world as far as creative writing and publishing is concerned. So what's your view on that?
Well, I think first thing to say about the podcast and having done it in lockdown when everyone was stuck at home, and in a way that gave us a huge opportunity to speak to some people who were not local, perhaps, or people that couldn't make it in for health reasons and whatever. And now we're kind of, I say back to normal. The listeners can't see me doing inverted commas. That we can have people in person and chat to people, and we can also have people as a kind of hybrid way. So that's going to be really great. We can interview some people from far and wide, and hopefully get to some listeners far and wide as well.
And this format's kind of normalised, isn't it now? We're actually in person here, which is really, really nice to do this in person. But in previous iterations, we did it via Zoom. But I think, it feels a bit weird saying that there are good things about the pandemic, and you've got to be quite careful with that. But as far as the publishing industry is concerned, and as far as careers are concerned, in a way, there were very interesting outcomes. Let's put it that way. I'm aware of new literary agencies starting. I'm aware of my own kind of output changing, really, and my focus changing from film predominantly to writing novels. So, how do you feel about that in terms of how it impacted your outlook and your career?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I don't know if we'll really have a great idea for many years to come. We're looking to academics and historians to kind of say, well, this is how things changed. Even in the publishing industry, there's so much change is the key word. But I know certainly books did very well during lockdowns, particularly. People had a lot of time at home. They bought books, whether they read them or not, we don't know. That's always harder to tell, but people bought a lot more books. E-books obviously were great and really useful. It saved people having to go out and queue up in masks in shops and so on, but books did really well. I think that's sort of leveling out a bit now, but I don't have the stats on that. No, that's up to my publisher. Funnily enough, I signed with my agent in February 2020.
Right.
So
what a time to do that.
Yeah, it was quite interesting. The world was starting to go a little bit crazy. I don't know if you remember that time, but we were starting to look over at China and things that are going on and thinking, okay, maybe we should be a little bit cautious.
I think there was a sense of disbelief of what was going on, and for that period and when it actually did really properly land here. Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
So that was really strange. I didn't meet my agent in person till maybe 18 months later. I can't remember exactly. We did everything online, had chats on the phone, which I suppose is kind of normal anyway. I don't know if many people these days, with the way the industry works, meet their agent firsthand and signs with the agent, like going to London and sitting over a table in the Ritz and signing some kind of book deal. It's not like that, as far as I know. At least that's not my experience. It might be for some people. So I think that's quite normal. It made things very weird, and then it became very weird trying to talk to people and get work going because everyone was so scared. And that's we could have a whole episode on that, I think.
Without a doubt. With Lexicon, one of our kind of mission statements really that we had originally, but something that I think we've been speaking about recently that we can develop, is the creative currency, the creative community at hand within LJMU and within Liverpool particularly. And what I've discovered since the pandemic, and that kind of segue from the pandemic to now, is that it is burgeoning, it is significant. It's existing almost kind of independently from London. There are kind of links with London, obviously, with publishers and so forth. But there's a storytelling community right here, and it's exciting. You know, something I think would be great to develop is bringing in guests, even within the compass of LJMU. What's your kind of experience working? I know because you grew up, or you were born in London. What's your experience being here in Liverpool and seeing this for yourself?
This is a moment for some shameless self-promotion in that 2 of the 3 books I published so far are set in Liverpool. So obviously it's had a huge impact on me as a person. Arguably one of the best cities in the world. I haven't visited all of them to tell, but definitely a very welcoming city, and something that stands out. It's not just the music, that it's obviously very famous for a certain group we won't mention because they come up all the time. But
John Paul, George and Ringo.
Yeah, all those sorts of things. I mean, music brought me to the city, but I stayed for the people, and what's so important about the people of this city is the storytelling, the art and culture in many ways, not just storytelling, but everything seems to have a story. Everything, anecdotes, you can sit in the pub and someone will tell you an anecdote. Most of the time it will be hilarious. A lot of the time it will be quite profound as well. So it's just one of those cities that I think unless you visit it and spend some good time here, you don't quite get that. But it's really important to the city, and it certainly had its impact on me. Absolutely,
and it has all the genres are here. Filmmakers choose to come here for that very reason, because visually it looks, it can look like other places, but it has a kind of such a breadth really within a relatively small radius. You can see. All kinds of different types of architecture. You can see the kind of, you can almost kind of see the history bleeding off through the streets, and I know this in particular, and something for the kind of pilot episode that we're looking to cover is the genre of historical fiction, because both of us are into that, and that's a kind of happy coincidence that we're doing this podcast together, and we're both published in historical fiction. I suppose that maybe to kick off, because I'm very, very curious about your progress, Mike, with your books, The German Nurse and German Messenger. What's behind your pull to historical fiction?
Well, I mean, I suppose that ties into one of the things I wanted to talk about, and the focus of this podcast is that we should both, so we're both academics in creative writing as well, and we're doing this here obviously in the university, in Liverpool John Moores University. And really, there's sort of 2 answers to that question. I read a lot of historical fiction. I was very much one of those one of those boys who didn't really get reading. I loved stories. But I didn't actually get really pulled to sort of visual media that a lot of men do, or young boys do. I loved The Hobbit. My mum gave me her copy of The Hobbit when I was a kid, and I loved that. And it took me a number of years to find something that I loved again, and I picked up a book about Vikings. And anyone knows me knows I'm obsessed with Scandinavian and Norse culture.
And good place for Vikings. Very good place for Viking Liverpool.
Funny that, around here there's loads of history. The Wirral particularly, very Viking-esque, a lot of names, which I find fascinating. But I loved reading historical fiction. These days I read everything, but that was certainly a genre that stuck me alongside the fantasy and science fiction that I loved from The Hobbit onwards. So I loved reading that, and then I started reading things like Bernard Cornwell. I loved that sort of adventure historical, but what he was very good at, or is very good at, is that he marries the adventure, the sort of drama of action storytelling with historical fact. He researches very well. He knows the setting, the story, the feel of those, and bridging those two is often a challenge. So I loved those, but it was only really when I came to John Moores University to do my master's in writing that I thought I should push myself outside my comfort zone, because up until that point I'd been, or considered myself, a science fiction writer with a little bit of fantasy on the side, because they're very close. And I'd had some short story, fantasy, science fiction stuff published, and I thought, well, I'm here to learn. So I've ticked that. I know science fiction, fantasy, tick that box. I know how to do that. I'll learn how to do something else while I've got these great tutors here that I can pick their brains and get some ideas out. And it was also it was coming up to the centenary of the start of the First World War. So my first book kind of came out of that. I sat down and thought, I want to write a sort of Bernard Cornwell-esque First World War novel set in Liverpool.
Right.
Because that's where I was living, and there was loads of talk at that point about how important the city had been, not just through the sort of Powers battalions and those sorts of things, but the northern cities, particularly in England, and being a southerner, this is quite enlightening, but the northern cities were decimated by the First World War, young men going off to fight and all those sorts of things. So I wanted to write that kind of adventure, something kind of drags you along, but you still have a kind of poignant tone to it, because this was a huge change in 20th century history, impacted so many people. And the more I wrote that draft while doing my masters, the more I realised you couldn't really do a Bernard Cornwell style First World War novel, which is probably why he hasn't done it himself, because it was an adventure. It wasn't. It was awful.
Yeah.
Absolutely awful. Those boys thought they were going on an adventure.
Yeah.
And that comes up in the novel.
Over by Christmas.
Yeah. I mean, there's a sort of mythology to that. But they certainly thought, well, I'm doing this dead-end job. I'm running down the docks in boots that are falling apart because that's all I can afford. To try and find a ship that I can get some work unloading. But 100 other guys have got there before me. So today I've got no income. And that day to day, the war comes along and the army says, we'll pay you. Here's a job. Oh, great. I get a job. I get some income. I can send that home to my family. But I also get to go see the world. You're with your mates. You get to go see the world, have an adventure. So that comes up in the novel, that idea that you're going on an adventure, but the story itself isn't an adventure. And the other aspect of that is the conscientious objection during the First World War. So that became a sort of counterpoint to that adventure. So I had two brothers, and it's funny because I have a brother. So, there's that sort of element of kind of writing what you know. But they're very different to me and my brother. I keep reminding him anyway. The first thing he said to me when I had it published was, so how did you kill me? But I won't say any more because that would be a spoiler. But it didn't work out like that. Not quite like that. I don't think either character is me and my brother. Maybe a combination of both our characteristics in each character. But the two showing the kind of so the older brother, he objects to the war and he does all the things that he needs to do and ends up getting in trouble for that because it was illegal really to object to the war, and there was all sorts of horrible stuff. And the younger brother, who's not even old enough, signs up as a boy soldier and goes out and fight. So we see their two stories side by side. But yeah, I started writing that as part of my masters and got some great feedback, and then carried on writing it. Finished the draft after the masters and sent it out on submission. And the rest, as they say, is history. That kind of started me on the historical fiction path. And thankfully, the publisher wanted more books.
Right. Yeah. Well, and that's fantastic. I suppose I think, in a sense, and this is kind of entirely my perspective on it, but science fiction and the so-called higher genres, there's a link between science fiction and historical fiction in the sense that you world building, in the sense that you build. It's an escapism, really. It's not the present day. It's not set in something that's kind of. It might be naturalistic in some aspects, but it is not the here and now. How do you feel about that?
I could fill 3 or 4 podcasts about that. Which I think we've got a remit for. For the sake of today's conversation, I think it's really interesting, and I think that's definitely something I like to say when I talk to people. I think some people find it a bit strange that I write sort of cross-genre. I write historical fiction, but then I also write made-up stuff. Why do stuff that's so entrenched in fact, but also make up stuff? And that's that thing. I think all fiction is written about now. Without going into too much detail about each of the books, the historical fiction books I've written, that there's so much in each of them that is still topical now. The one I'm working on at the moment has so much to do with politics and right-wing populism and all that sort of stuff. I can't talk about that book so much just yet, but maybe further down the line. And I think that's true of both historical fiction. We look back at the past and see, okay, we're still making these mistakes. Hopefully we can learn from that at some point in human history. And then science fiction and fantasy, the same thing. We're looking at that same idea through a different lens, perhaps going further into the future to look back at ourselves and hold that mirror up to us and say, well, look, we're
That's really interesting because, in a sense, both genres that's another thing they share. It's only just really occurred to me now you've just said it, that they have this thing that they're analogous to our lives. They have resonance because they're actually telling us something. I mean, H.G. Wells, let's go far back with science fiction. War of the Worlds, was it about Martians invading us, or was it about British imperialism?
Yeah, I mean, you could you have read my PhD to know about that. But yeah, the War of the Worlds, H.G. Wells, as far as I'm concerned, was writing about the rise of imperialism in European empires at the time. So it was the Victorian period leading up to the First World War. It was not a surprise to anyone really that the First World War happened, because everyone was manoeuvring in Europe, particularly, talking very Eurocentric. Every state or monarchy or empire, whatever it was positioning to get more, whatever more was, whether it's land or resources or whatever. So he was writing about that, and he used the lens of aliens to sort of say, well, war's bad, as banal as that might sound, but for a really interesting lens. And that's why I think escapism is a really interesting term, and I sort of fight back against it. And I don't want people, I absolutely agree. Reading is a joyous thing. Reading a really good book, and you can just get into that story world and escape your own stuff and do all that. That's the power of books. Of any kind of storytelling medium, really. They all have different aspects of that. But I also think it's really important that they're reflective and they are telling us something about the world. How it is to be human, what it means to be human, how to be human, all those sorts of things that we all struggle with day-to-day basis, with mental health, physical health, relationships, and so on. And I think that's the hugely important thing of storytelling.
So the German Messenger, I've got it right in front of me. Great picture on the front of the live buildings and what looks like some Heinkel bombers coming over the city. I've actually got a resonance with this era, 1940, and the May Blitz of 41. I very nearly wouldn't be sitting here, Mike. The Luftwaffe dropped a parachute bomb in Walton, nearly killed my dad. Oak door flew off and missed him by inches. That's my little story, but I'm really interested in this the connection between Liverpool, the Blitz, the Second World War. Tell us a bit about the German Messenger.
Yeah, I mean, I wish you'd told me that when I was writing it, because it would have gone in the book. And it comes back to our earlier point about Liverpool and storytelling, because there are a number of things in that book where I've told people locally, I'm writing this book in Liverpool during the Blitz. And they've said, as you did, my grandma or whatever, someone told me a great story about, it's a sad story, but it's great from a storytelling point of view, of their grandmother, whenever there was a thunderstorm, would go and hide under the stairs, because it brought back those memories of the bombing. It sounds the same. It's catastrophic, and it just brought back that, I guess, PTSD. So I made sure that was in the book because I wanted that authenticity. I didn't steal names and things like that, but just that idea of these little stories, little anecdotes, as I mentioned earlier, are really important. So yeah, I think for me it was a return. The German Messenger was returned to Liverpool for me. The first book, as I talked about before, had been set in Liverpool, and then I wrote about the occupation of Guernsey because I was fascinated by that. I wanted to look at what it was like to be British, but under German or Nazi occupation. And thankfully that didn't happen to the mainland, but Guernsey was, the Channel Islands was severely affected by that. But I wrote that in lockdown, and that was really difficult to research because the German Messenger was coming back to a city that I know very well. I've lived in Liverpool for 13 years now, and the great thing, as we've talked about this city, is people will tell you stories, so it's easy to pick up bits and pieces that you can use. There's still loads of research to do. But I also wanted to look at that idea, because being a Londoner, the Blitz is synonymous with London. I think in most people's minds, when you mention the Blitz, they will visualize London. And obviously London was heavily bombed. It's the capital city, seat of Parliament, seat of the monarchy, and so on. It was heavily bombed. But there were other cities in the UK that were heavily bombed: Glasgow, Birmingham, Coventry, absolutely, yeah. And Liverpool, and Liverpool being Liverpool doesn't get talked about enough. And I think, I don't know, I feel like as someone who's kind of moved here, an adopted Scouser, if you like, who's come to love the city, I feel like I kind of have a voice to speak to people outside the city and say, this is a great place.
Yeah.
And maybe they'll listen to me a bit more than locals, because you guys have lost your voice in that respect, perhaps. Maybe that's a bit pretentious, I don't know. But I feel like that. I feel like that's a nice thing that I can do and try and show how great Liverpool is. And so that's one aspect. The other aspect is during COVID, and it's funny how the conversation keeps coming back to that. It's almost like the Second World War and the First World War. COVID was kind of our 21st century huge global event that's going to mark us for years, which is something I write about in the books. While I'm writing in those times, it's clear, I think, to readers how the world changed through these stories. And I got sick of the discussion in COVID times of the Blitz spirit. It wound me up
They even wheeled out Vera Lynn, who was about 101 or something, didn't they, just before she passed on?
There was something like that. I avoided all of that.
Captain Tom and...
Yeah. I mean, Captain Tom, what he did, he shouldn't have had to do, was a great thing. And a very honourable man. But it was that kind of narrative of the Blitz spirit. Well, there's horrible things happening. So if we all pulled together, and the historian Lucy Worsley did a programme on the Blitz spirit on the BBC, which I found fascinating and became a huge part of my research. I watched it a few times, talking about that idea of the Blitz spirit. One of the things that really stuck with me, she showed this image, and it's quite an iconic image, and I think lots of people have seen it, of a milkman walking across a pile of rubble in London after a bombing with the milk bottle tray in his hand. And it was posted all across the newspapers of, look, milkman carries on his day-to-day job. Don't worry about the bombing. We'll be fine. Only that photo was taken by an American photographer who had come over to create some propaganda for America, so that they could send that home and ease worries of America if they were to get into the war and start getting bombed. And the milkman was his assistant. They'd found a white coat, some milk bottles, and said, you guys stand over there, we'll take a photo. And it becomes this iconic thing, and it's used, and it shows, particularly in the age of AI and all those sorts of things, how powerful an image can be and how wrong it can be. Because that has not happened. In that same series, it's definitely worth watching if you're interested in history. There was talk of, she talked about a bomb shelter in the West End of London, I think it was. I forget exactly where there were about 1,000 people all crammed into this underground warehouse, and no toilets or anything like that. They had 3 buckets between 1,000 people. And can you just imagine that the bombs are falling down above? You can hear them because it's reverberating through the ground, through the ceiling, and if you need to go to the loo, you've got to sit on a bucket in front of 999 other people.
So is that the type of sort of sensory experience that you've mapped to your writing?
I've tried to show bits of that. Yeah, there are scenes set within bomb shelters. The 2 characters are volunteers, so they're out underneath the bombs as well. But there are reasons why they end up in the shelters as well, for various reasons. Because I wanted to show that. I wanted to show how, or try to evoke that feeling of just sheer terror, complete lack of control. You have no say over what's happening to you. You're lucky if you can get into shelter, particularly early on in the Blitz when there weren't really proper shelters. It was find an underground space, dig a hole in your garden. Many people, particularly in Liverpool, as I said before, hid under the stairs. So they thought if the building goes down, the stairs should provide some protection.
Kitchen table. That's a classic.
Kitchen table. All those sorts of things. A bit like an earthquake, stand in the doorway, those sorts of things. So I wanted to show that, but I wanted to show the idea or the fallacy of the Blitz spirit. I read a lot of local newspapers and the Central Library has a great archive of Liverpool Echo and Liverpool Daily Post. What fascinated me, there's these sort of letters to the editor, and so many of them were, I walked past so-and-so house on so-and-so street in Egbert, let's say, and I was disappointed to note that in the upstairs bedroom, the light was on and there was no blackout curtain. And I'd just like to say to this person that you're putting all of our lives in danger. And this happened daily. There were these comments lately. And And a lot of them were in that typical Liverpudlian sense of humour. They were quite tongue-in-cheek, but a lot of them were quite passive-aggressive in that British way, that we do so well. So I wanted to show that, and there's scenes in there where the main male character, Anthony, is a ARP warden. And I wanted to get away from the ARP warden.
Put that light out.
Yeah, of Dad's Army. I didn't want that character. So he's quite compassionate, but he comes across some really nasty people who just don't care, and they think, it's not going to happen to me. I'm not going to get COVID. It's fine. Right.
Therein lies the analogy.
So there's very much an essence there of what was happening to us at that time, that Blitz spirit of exceptionalism, and unfortunately, thousands of people were killed in Liverpool alone during the Blitz, and many, many more were made homeless. So it's all about those ideas. I think you can be blasé and say it's a romantic story set in the war with a bit of tension, makes it a bit kind of tingly, and it's a bit of fun. But I hope that readers get so much more from that. And
this is another aspect to historical fiction, which I think it's easy to kind of lose sight of, and that it is close to our lives now. Everything you were talking about there, Mike. I mentioned that the outdoor flying off of the parachute bomb. Both my parents grew up. They were children during the Second World War, and they gave me very sort of visceral accounts of stuff that went on. So, my mum told me about the sound of German bombers coming on, and a very distinctive sound over the British aircraft. So it was, and the American aircraft. So it was like a boom, 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 boom. It's a really kind of almost kind of ominous type of hum. And my perception of that is she must have been absolutely terrified. And I asked her that, and she said no. It was just the way it was, and maybe that was the stoicism, or maybe it's just the innocence of a kid growing up, and that neither of them were evacuated for some reason. So that period of time still has, and I want to get onto the American Civil War, which is my little obsession. There's still very, very real present day connections to that.
Yeah, the idea that our history is who we are, and it's a really important conversation at the moment, more than it ever was, and I think that becomes increasingly the case when we talk about things like slavery and knocking down statues and things like that. It is who we are, and there are right and wrong ways of preserving that, of course, and right and wrong ways, and right and wrong people to revere, and that's something I talk about.
One thing, and perhaps this links your work and my work in a way, is that I'm paraphrasing E.L. Doctorow, who was a famous writer, who said that historians can recount events and even paint a picture, but the writer allows you to feel the time and place, allows you pretty much, it takes you there, and that's everything I sought out to do with Water Street. How does that map to your historical fiction?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, something I think about a lot. And something I think I expect to get asked a lot more than I do. And to me, that question is, why historical fiction over writing history? And I enjoy reading history, non-fiction, to use that term, non-fiction. I think we're doing two different jobs that complement each other, perhaps. I think that history is about being objective and giving detail. Facts is a kind of loaded term, and I think facts can also make it sound quite dry, which is unfair of a lot of historical writers there. But a good historical book that's talking about something, an event that actually happened, and here are the details, and here's the context globally, etc. But what we can do as historical fiction is we can look at a subsection of that, or a smaller part of that, and we can put our characters into that and ask questions in a way that historical writers cannot ask the same questions, because they have to remain objective. And if they start to put characters in there, then they would start to perhaps colour what they're examining. As writers, as fiction writers, well, that's our toolbox. We can look at a character and say, well, what would it be like to live through the Blitz? What would I get up in the morning and do? What would I eat? How would I interact with other people? What is my life? And so we show, I think, at least that's how I approach historical fiction. So I look at, I take a character and a setting and put the two together and say, how does this impact them as if they were a real person? And I hope my readers feel they are real characters and get a sense of that. And I think that's true of all historical fiction.
Yeah.
You know, whether it's World War II or American Civil War. So how do you feel, to flip it back onto you, how do you feel about that? And we'll introduce your book a little bit in a second.
Yeah. Well, my take on it is that you can be a historian and do it well or badly. You can be a writer of historical fiction and do it well or badly. And they are sort of, you're right that I think they're very closely linked, but you know, there's a purpose for both of them. Certainly within the community of historians that are out there, and you've got the very famous ones that are kind of on the TV all the time, the likes of Dan Snow, Lucy Worsley, you mentioned, David Olasuga. You've got locally, and we're doing a Roscoe lecture with Malik Al-Nasser, who is a noted Cambridge scholar about the slave trade, not just in Liverpool, but the international slave trade, and his own connections to both sides of the coin. So you've got a kind of a regeneration of historians really who are out there and very skillfully putting together various types of media on this. So sometimes there is a question, you know, why do you need to write novels about this when you've got historians who are perfectly capable of putting together figures and even in a sense putting together a kind of document or a documentary style account of a period of history. To my mind, that is, you know, you could widen that and say, right, why write about anything when you can find out, you know, why write about science fiction when you can find out how rockets work? It's a similar sort of point that you would be making.
Well, this is where I have to put my science fiction hat on and say it's not just about rockets.
It's not just about rockets.
The rockets are merely a plot device, but we'll come back to that.
We could get about Monty Python and that one, couldn't we? Like, yeah, absolutely. But the thing is, for me,
science fiction ever given us?
Exactly. But the thing is, you know, and I am being flippant there. I think I know my own set of motivations for writing Water Street, which is Water Street is about the Liverpool's connection with the American Civil War, but it also happened at a very, very important time for the city and indeed for the world. In a sense, the mid-19th century, we were moving into a kind of an industrialized age. Things were changing by the moment. The key sort of events that affected the city, recent to 1863 when Water Street is set, the Great Irish Hunger. So you had this huge influx of refugees or immigrants coming in from Ireland, and you know, if you were to walk around the city at the time, you would, chances are you would bump into someone very quickly who was from Ireland, a native Irish speaker. They were the accents you were hearing. So you kind of collide that together with Liverpool being strategically and economically a very, very important place to the United States. You know, this kind of links into the bigger question of why write about an historical period when you can ask an historian. There are so many sort of disparate elements or seemingly disparate elements that I've aimed to bring together within Water Street, not to make it complicated because the story isn't that complicated. They try and blow up a boat to begin with, and it kind of unravels from there. But it was being able to take that period of 1863 and make sense of it. Many people, like you mentioned before, Mike, aren't that aware of just how integral this city was, not just to the British and the British Empire, and not just in terms of its relationship with London, but actually as a standalone powerhouse. You had the trade, shipping, banking. At that time, communication, we hadn't quite cracked the thing of electronic communication, i.e. telegraphs as it was. It was starting, but it wasn't quite there. So 1863, you know, you didn't have that kind of instant communication, so everything had to be within a kind of short radius.
That's really interesting. Can I just come in on that?
Yeah, yeah.
Because something for me about writing historical fiction is the technology. Perhaps coming from my science fiction background, but I have the use of telephones. But the thing to remember in the 1940s is not everyone had a telephone, and they certainly weren't walking around with mobile phones in their pockets and easy access to information. So propaganda had so much more of an effect. We could get into how much of an effect propaganda has now. But I'm interested in the challenges of writing that in the 19th century as a historical fiction writer, because I think that's something that, with our fiction hats on, becomes more important perhaps as a fiction writer than it would to a historian who's trying to show the effects, but the day-to-day. And also I wanted to ask about the challenge of writing. So you're writing, so the book is Water Street as J.P. Maxwell. And you're writing about Liverpool during the time of the American Civil War.
Yeah.
But obviously the American Civil War is happening across the Atlantic. So what's the challenge of writing about an event, but also so distant from it?
So there were a handful of nuggets, really, and that's what did the work for me. I didn't really have to look very far, at least to begin with. I'd long known that there was a Confederate influence within the city, and there were all kind of political machinations behind that. One massive economic reason, and normally you can boil anything down to money, really, was that the Union, which eventually won out in the American Civil War, they were blocking the southern ports, so they were blocking all kinds of trade, military aid, anything that was coming in. They wanted to stop, and they had a navy. The Confederacy, for a long period during the American Civil War, understandably, because they were a very new sort of collection of states, really, didn't have much of a navy. In turn, 4,000 miles away from the theatre of conflict, this really, really annoyed a lot of very nouveau riche people within Liverpool. Let's not forget, you've got the cotton. It's the centre of the world cotton trade, which is one of the booming trades. I focus on king cotton, but there were also the sugar, rum, tobacco, a long list of sort of slave industries were focused here. So even though slavery had, for quite a long time been officially abolished and made illegal in Britain, the proceeds of it were clear and present, and the city was growing exponentially as a result. And what happened in this particular period, in a very short space of time, I'm talking about a year, the cotton supply started to dry up from the US, and they called it a cotton drought. So there was a direct link between that and the building of warships and variety, all the variety you get in the Navy. We had the best technology in the world here at Camel Laird in terms of shipbuilding. We had the best crews came from Liverpool. I'm not just saying that as a kind of, hey, I'm Scouts proud, we got the best crews in Liverpool. It's more actually a case of it was because, the city had a huge influence. It was in modern terms, it was roughly about the size of Paris in comparative terms, which blows people's minds. But it did have a really, really strong influence, and you had people coming in off the boats from Ireland. So there's this melting pot, this mix. The famous sort of statement about it is that Liverpool was in favour of the Confederacy and Manchester was in favour of the Union for the, Manchester's sort of progression with, socialism and women's rights and being a kind of moral vanguard hadn't quite reached Liverpool in a lot of ways. I think that's a story in itself. But my motivation for writing Water Street was just to bring all this out and finding the right sort of carrier for it. I found some very interesting sort of characters that lived, that were around. Water Street is a kind of a mishmash of real people and completely fictional characters and characters that are a combination between fictional and real. particularly the central character Harriet, who comes over from Louisiana with her husband Bannister, and both of these are based on real people. And Harriet is, on the surface, a sweet Southern belle. She's got her sort of a very close maid, Conte, who is a Creole, descended from Haitian revolutionaries, and there's a clue in that as to their nature. And very, very quickly in the book we find out that actually her being like this kind of loyal, demure Southern wife is a complete sham. She's spying on her husband and she wants to sabotage him. So that's
a great hook.
That's that's straight off. It's like, because then there's a tension.
Yeah.
The tension is, the question is he going to discover her? And when he does, what is he going to do? And we see right from the off that Bannister, I like the name Bannister because it's very close to bastard. That's
appropriate. Okay.
And I think he is based on a real guy, as is Anne Harriet's based on a real person. Bannister Dunwoody is based on James Dunwoody Bullock, who was a commander. He's actually buried in Smithdown Road Cemetery.
Really?
And some people like to drape Confederate flags on his gravestone. That's one of the sort of things that still goes on. But he was active in all kinds of ways. He actually rumoured to have a role in the Lincoln assassination as well. But James Dunwoody Bullock was this sort of he was their man in Liverpool. Now, let's not forget that in that short period of their existence, the Confederacy had 2 consuls in Liverpool. They got the first consulate. They decided to move from Rumford Place, which is just down towards Water Street and Castle Street around there, up to Abercrombie Square, which is now actually part of the University of Liverpool, chiefly because they wanted to fund not just ships, but actually gain influence in Europe. Bullock was in cahoots with a South Carolinian Frenchman called Charles Prelow, who was really, really active in raising funds for the Confederacy and petitioning very powerful people over here. So I've found out in my research, going directly to archives in the US, that the Confederacy were close to bringing in European powers. The British were kind of reluctant to get involved on that level because the Crimea wasn't too far in the rearview mirror, and they got, even though they won in theory, they took quite a hammering, and it was a vicious war, the Crimean War. But the trading interests were really starting to tip of the balance, and there were lobbies to actually go on either side and really throw their lot in with it. So this is a kind of political stew. You add in the Irish question with the Fenian movement. This is what I wanted to bring together in Water Street into kind of, into 70,000 words. So yeah, it's an absolute obsession. It's become something that's sort of taken over. But I am realizing, not just in the writing of it, in the publishing of it, but actually in the kind of dissemination of the book, that it is still very, very resonant now.
Yeah, that's fascinating in the sense of what I was talking about as well, and how historical fiction, we're looking at a particular cross-section of history, but so many lessons to learn about now. We haven't stopped having conversations about slavery. America's impact on the world is still huge, and their history, the divisions in their history are still so prominent that reading these stories that we know so little about in England, it's not something that we have as part of our formal historical education, the American Civil War and things. It's something we learn about abstractly. I think that's, it's really important to pick up on. Interesting, you talk about 70,000 words and things as well. I think it's worth mentioning for listeners that these sorts of questions, we'll come back to in the future. I think we want to talk about publishing, how that all works, get some guests on who can speak with more authority on that than us, or maybe more experience, whether they're writers or people who work within publishing. And so check back in, and we'll cover all those sorts of things and everything we can think about publishing.
Absolutely, Mike. Well, we'll look forward to doing more of these. I think it's been interesting alone. We could probably fill a series, us two chatting away, because there's enough between us. But it'll be interesting to bring in other personalities into the conversation. So yeah, look forward to the next Lexicon. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.